Welcome back, degenerates, degeneratas, and esteemed members of the Degenerati, to the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 302, Makhachev Poirier. A fight many years in the making, some would say, but be feigning enthusiasm to say it would be highly anticipated, given many red flags from the underdog, but we'll get into those later. I think there are some much more interesting fights up and down the card, in spite of the fact that most of the lines at this point have blown out to 2-1 or worse, but I'll be happy to get into breakdowns on all of those. If you've hung around for the first year of the MMA RAXPOD while we're still in beta, and probably will be for the foreseeable future, thank you very much. I believe the first show I did was at the end of May, about a year ago. So as we prepare for this June 1st, 2024 card, I thank you very much if you're one of the subscribers for the show on YouTube. But also, I went over 1.3 million followers on 1.3 thousand followers on Twitter this week. Maybe million one day, but for now, I'm very grateful. I started the show as a thank you for 500 followers on Twitter last year, and it took me about a year just to get to that amount, and I was very grateful for that. I was hopeful to hit 1,000 by, I think, this point. After I hit the 500, and to be well over that mark, I would say I'm a little bit ahead of schedule from where I thought I would be, and still growing. So thank you very much, and if you haven't already, please like and share and subscribe on Twitter and YouTube, and I'll be happy to keep bringing you more free content for the entire life cycle of this platform. Before getting into 11 reads, 10 picks total for this upcoming pay-per-view. By the way, if you tuned in for the on-camera debut of the last RAXPOD, not bad, right? I think that was the second most successful pay-per-view I've ever had from a units perspective. Actually, that's not true. Third most. 298 earlier this year. Obviously, that was the clean sweep, and that was 63 units. I believe UFC 292 last year was 49.5 units, aided heavily by that massive underdog victory from Sean O'Malley, who, in hindsight, it was quite funny that he was a plus 200 or greater underdog. And then UFC 301... very, very chalky card. Didn't get any underdogs correct, but still ended up going, what? The only two picks I missed on the card were Brenner and Jonathan Martinez. And given the enthusiasm around the King of Rio and seeing so many other people on Jose Aldo, I did correctly decide to stay away from Jonathan Martinez as a parlay leg, and that paid off quite well. Hit a 6-leg parlay, which was nice to see, and came out of that one with 30 units. So good way to offset a lot of the losses that had been taken since that clean sweep at UFC 298. I've tried to do a bit of a better job since then about picking spots. Stayed off of the card last week because I recognized that I was mostly on the side of favorites that I wasn't entirely confident in. A bit of a different story this week, and part of it is, the recurring trend of confidence that I've had with these pay-per-views going back to UFC 290 last year. Bigger set of sample size for a lot of these fighters that are competing, as opposed to a lot of the newer fighters that we see on many of these smaller fight night cards, particularly the Apex events, some of which just end up being glorified Dana White's Contender Series fights. But feeling pretty good this week. Do want to do a quick recap of last week just for the one favorite that I did miss, which was the Clayton Rodriguez and Alatong Haley fight. Going to be pretty brief because I had that one graded pretty close. And Haley is someone that I had previously had pretty good reads on, and in most cases had chosen to err on the side of caution and just hedge against rounds. Very early in my betting career, that came back to bite me because I took the +2.5 when he fought Kevin Kroom, which was a very, very misguided decision in light of the fact that Kroom had been dropping multiple weight classes and had already demonstrated problems with his chin. So very early lesson learned in that one. I was a bit too reliant on the idea that Haley hadn't really demonstrated lights out power. I still don't think he's the hardest hitter around, and that he's a little bit overconfident in his power, given how much of that hasn't really translated to knockdowns or high-level damage success while in the UFC. But the weight cut for Kroom was just way too much, and came back to bite him pretty heavily in that one. Still, from taping those other fights that he's participated in, you really there was a lot of enthusiasm about what kind of a wrestler that Haley would be, and but part of the wrestling isn't being able to just get takedowns. It's also being able to retain dominant position. And you saw in a lot of Haley's more recent fights that he was too willing to allow fighters to get back to their feet, to just completely sacrifice dominant position when he had gotten it. So I really was not impressed at all by his ability to retain position when fights would happen to get on the ground. But by contrast, I did recognize that the risk with Clayton, if the fight didn't stay on the feet, was that, he's not only a young fighter that was prone to making several mistakes, but one thing that you saw when he fought CJ Vergara was that he was too willing to, and I use this term quite frequently, be a bit of a guard goblin, just give away rounds by whether fighting off of his back or just trying to remain in full guard while on his back and allow his opponent to remain in top control. Just was too willing to stay on the mat in a vulnerable position and not make enough of an effort to get back to his feet. I was surprised that he didn't get the second round of that fight against Haley unanimously, just because it was, I thought, pretty evident that he had been doing more damage to Haley's leg and clearly had more striking success than Haley throughout the fight. I thought my read about how that fight was going to play out on the feet was pretty accurate, that Haley just didn't throw enough volume, was too reliant on 1-2s. But the narrative for that fight was pretty clear in terms of how it was going to go when Rodriguez threw a kick a bit too sloppily early in the first, that Haley was able to turn into a takedown. And Haley really, I saw a lot of people that were critical of the fact that that fight didn't really get stood up. And I don't think Haley necessarily didn't do enough activity that would have necessitated that, but he clearly did not win that fight based on damage. It was very much the optics of him being able to remain in control and Rodriguez just not making enough of an effort to get back up. And we didn't really see Haley do a lot of that retaining dominant position in his more recent performances. The Chad Anheliger fight comes to mind for me, that Haley had, where he was just way too, even though he won that fight 30-27, he was just kind of coasting on the fact that Anheliger was a much further aged opponent and had far less of a speed advantage. And I believe he shot a takedown late in the fight, but again, didn't really make much of an effort to keep the fight on the ground in the moments that it got there, and was just very much wanting to keep that fight standing in spite of the fact that he might have presumably had more success on the ground, just given what we saw when he actually tried to retain dominant position here against Rodriguez. But I also think it plays into the fact that Rodriguez didn't make enough of an effort to get up himself. So that fight I had graded pretty close. I'm glad that I ended up staying off of that card, because I probably would have wanted to make Rodriguez a parlay leg based on the fact that I didn't want to play Nolan at the odds that he was at, and I was going to have to rely on a Yanez Garimbo Murphy parlay that wasn't going to quite get 3 to 4 units up to 10 the way that I try to get every week with a 3 or 4 leg parlay. I was going to have to employ another favorite with possibly a higher unit risk than 4 if I wanted to get to 3 or 4 to win 10, and I would have been out on the first fight of the card. And even though I had Murphy graded to win, I wasn't supremely confident in how he was going to do either, based on the performance that Sadiq Yusuff had against Barboza. I really thought that what Murphy ended up doing to Barboza last week was or 2 weeks ago rather, was what Yusuff should have done to Barboza, and did early in the fight before kind of totally losing steam and falling apart. But nothing risked, nothing gained. I'm satisfied with that. And based on the fact that I've done extremely well with pay-per-views over the last year, I felt good about holding off for one more week and saving my units for trying to eat back into a bit of the hole that I'm still in for 2024 by, hopefully building off of the good momentum that we got from UFC 301 and seeing how this card goes. I was a little bit concerned when I got done grading all of these because, I'm going to be honest, I kind of had to go out of my way to find plus odds plays for this one, and I know that most of my reads have been kind of chalky of late, at least the cards that I've had a lot of success on. Hasn't been a great run of success for my underdog picks over the last month or so. I think going back to 301, I'm like 2-6. Which lifetime I'm really pretty solidly at 50%. I recently crossed the 1,000 picks lifetime threshold for my grading system. I actually did that the week prior to this last fight night card, and I was dead even at underdogs lifetime, capping them at 50%, which is much higher than the market average, even among, cappers that are, in the top 100 with a sample of over 400 picks at least. But still, for a recent trend of 2-6, I'm looking to have a little bit of a bounce back here soon. So at least one line is flipped in the time since I had been doing the grading to recording the podcast now, and we'll get into that a bit later. But I think it's about time that we start talking about these UFC 302 fights. So we will begin with Andre Lima and Mitch Raposo. Lima is undefeated after scoring a disqualification win over Igor Severino at the end of March at UFC Fight Night Rebus Namajunas in a fight that I wanted to pick Lima to win. I had him graded just ever slightly above Severino, but ultimately decided to stay off of that one just because it was too close to call, and neither fighter really had much experience beyond Contender Series. And it felt like a good decision, at least through the first 5 minutes, to put that as a stay away. Given the first round was pretty close, Lima presumably had better damage optics, but I know Severino had his moments of control and success, and 2 of the judges gave the first round to Lima. Severino got rewarded for a 10-9 from one of the judges. Lima started having, I think, more success in the second round. Severino got a bit frustrated and bit him. Bite of the night, folks, including yours truly, were calling it, and promptly got disqualified for that. It was funny before they actually showed the bite mark on Lima's arm that there were people live reacting to it. They were kind of like, oh, he's overselling it for the DQ, and he's, taking the coward's way out, which is what everybody says every time a fight is ending by, you know, a legal knee or, you know, a groin shot or something, like, oh, he's always quitting. But and then everybody felt pretty stupid when they showed on the live broadcast. It was like, oh no, Severino actually just straight up bit him. Like, that is a pretty ridiculous thing to see happen. So I think jury's still out a little bit on, you know, Lima, but he's only 25 years old, and I think all things considered has showed out pretty well, not only his Contender Series performance, but had good momentum in the Severino fight before that one ended up as a DQ. Conversely, Mitch Raposo last appeared around the UFC on Dana White's Contender Series in 2021, where he, according to many, was winning his fight against Jake Hadley before kind of falling apart in the second round and ultimately conceding a loss by submission. Hadley at that point was undefeated. He's since kind of, his UFC, you don't want to say it's entirely gotten away from him, but he's become, I think, an example of how the UFC loves promoting these undefeated UK fighters that end up being underwhelming in many respects. I think another good example is Mick Parkin, even though he hasn't seen a loss yet. Christian Leroy Duncan, I think, would be another great example, and he's obviously, you know, he had the very underwhelming performance, lost his undefeated record against Armen Petrosyan last year. So the Hadley loss has not necessarily aged gracefully, but it is the only loss of his MMA career. He is 9-1 since. Prior to going into Contender Series, he had appeared on Cage Titans FC 4 times and went back to that promotion for his 2 most recent fights and earned 2 knockout victories, which was one more than he had during his first run with the promotion. And last appeared in January of this year, and now gets the short notice call up to fight Andre Lima as the 3rd opponent in this matchmaking. I think that kind of illustrates like why the line is sitting where it's at. Lima was barely a 2-1 favorite much earlier in the week when I graded this fight, and he's since ballooned out to -260. And I think that that's just more of a reflection of the fact that Raposo's taking this on short notice. It'll be curious to see if he does end up making weight for this, just because it's the cut to flyweight. It's the hardest one to make. And he is taking this on only, I think it's going to be barely a week and a half notice before the fight actually happens. Everybody was taping that insanely difficult to pronounce, not Mongolian name last week before he ultimately became the second pullout for this fight. And Raposo, even though he did show out well against Jake Hadley 3 years ago, and recently showcased, one-punch knockout power that I think would have been a more, pronounced selling point for Lima prior to Raposo showcasing that within his last couple of Cage Titans appearances. It might have been in his CES appearance. I'm forgetting at this point which one it was where he got the more impressive knockout. But I will say his the first return appearance he had to Cage Titans, he did get that knockout in under a minute. So it's possible it could have been that one. But I digress. Either way, Raposo, I think, is, I wouldn't necessarily expect him to get finished here, but I think that Lima has shown enough through these first 2 fights that he's shown, and we're going to talk about Cesar Almeida later, but he's kind of shown a similar, impressiveness to Almeida in the regards of being someone that gets taken down, does a good job of getting back to their feet, and then I think more so than even Almeida does, has shown good ability to, after getting taken down, getting back up, making the most of the opportunities on the feet to put the fight back in their favor and make enough of an impression with with the judges relative to damage and standing strikes. The big thing that stands out to me here, just regarding the numbers, and I know these are small sample sizes, that, Raposo only landed a quarter of his strikes that he put on Hadley. That stands as a big concern to me, given, Hadley's kind of proven to be hittable and shown striking holes on the feet, which is one of the reasons why I faded him against Charles Johnson. The other thing that stands out to me here is that Lima had to deal with, if not necessarily a pronounced reach disadvantage, again, in his last fight with Severino, he was still giving up 1.5 inches of reach here, and he is going to have a 3.5-inch reach advantage here against Raposo for a guy that does prefer to keep the fight standing and make his impressions with standing strikes. So if Raposo doesn't enjoy takedown success, even if he does, I still like Lima's ability to be able to return to the feet, and then on the feet, he's going to have the reach advantage here to be able to make the most of his gifts relative to the reach advantage that he's going to have here. And I think that it will probably end up going to decision. Both of these guys have only been to decision twice. Only Raposo's been finished, as I mentioned, in that aforementioned loss to Jake Hadley. But I think both of these guys are pretty good with dealing with the damage. But again, the Raposo taking this on short notice, you wonder how his weight cut is going to go. If he ends up making weight, great. If he doesn't, I think that you are potentially looking at a situation where Lima might have a bit more finishing upside than he would otherwise going into this. I think Lima's probably going to end up grinding out like a 29-28 decision. It's possible Raposo enjoys some early success, but I think that he's going to have trouble implementing a takedown-focused game plan on Lima as his other opponents have for the duration of 15 minutes. And even if Lima ends up dropping the first round, I would expect him to get the better of the remaining 10 minutes on his way to a 29-28 unanimous. So give me Andre Lima here. I don't love that his price is ballooning out as it has. I do still think he's playable at 260, even from the 205 that I called earlier this week. But if this gets out to minus 300 by fight day, especially if Raposo ends up showing difficulty with the weight cut, which could probably make the price go out even further than it has, I think at that point you probably just have to look at this as a stay away. But for now, I like where Lima's at relative to, his confidence as an undefeated fighter, going to be enjoying that reach advantage, going to presumably be the much more accurate striker on the feet. It's just going to be a question of, does he continue to show that trend of being able to positively deal with opponents that rely on a volume of takedowns, and is he going to be able to return to the feet? I think that the market seems to agree with me that he's going to be able to handle that storm well. Even if Raposo loses this, because he's, kind of doing the UFC a solid on short notice, I would expect him to get a better matchup, particularly as a younger prospect in this flyweight division the next time he comes out. And it'll be interesting to see where he goes from here. I know there's a lot of people that are, fond of these New England-focused fighters and want to, see more of them in the UFC. We'll see how it goes. I do think he's sort of coming into his own and might have been a bit too soon for Dana White's Contender Series when he was here 3 years ago. And Hadley, a loss to Hadley certainly isn't a shame given the guy is still with the promotion. There's a lot of people that go on Contender Series, end up losing to someone that washes out, and then end up getting a second shot some time later, and perhaps they don't necessarily deserve it as much. I don't think that's the case here. I think he's shown enough within the last 3 years, and particularly at such a young age, that this is an appropriate replacement call-up for him, even if the odds seem to be stacked against him. But give me Andre Lima to win by unanimous decision. The next fight is Bassil Hafez and Mickey Gall. Hafez enters 8-4-1 and was last seen nearly a year ago in what was a short notice replacement that nearly resulted in one of the biggest upsets of the year last year in a fight that I honestly felt that Hafez should have won. Took a split decision loss to Jack Della Maddalena. Della Maddalena's performance in that one prompted me to pick Gilbert Burns to upset him at UFC 299 a few months ago. And according to the scorecards, Burns was on his way to winning that one if he had survived the third round. Unfortunately, Della Maddalena was able to scramble back to his feet and catch him with a knee while Gilbert was shooting again, and ended up getting what proved to be a comeback victory despite being a pretty decent favorite in that one. I know a lot of people are fond of Jack Della Maddalena, but this performance that he had against Hafez a year ago, I think, is one that's going to kind of haunt him for a little bit, just relative to capping his ability and what his title contender trajectory may or not be in this welterweight division. Hafez did look great early in that one. I thought he did enough to win the first 2 rounds. He definitely won the first round. I'm trying to recall if it was in the second or third round that Della Maddalena kind of made an unforced error in terms of allowing Hafez to kind of control him for the second half of it. Might have been either the second or the third round, but obviously Della Maddalena was clearly winning that fight on the feet. Hafez wanted nothing to do with him on the feet, ended up shooting 20 takedowns just to land 3 of them, which is why his takedown accuracy is reflected so poorly in this at only 15%, and also why his standing striking numbers are across the board worse than Mickey Gall's. Who is coming into... Gall has spent nearly his entire MMA career in the UFC. Outside of his MMA debut, all his 11 other appearances in his career have all been with the promotion. It's fairly speculated that he was just brought in as one of these guys that probably wouldn't entirely outclass CM Punk during that sort of gimmick in 2016. But Gall made a decent run for himself, although obviously with every level up in competition he experienced, was never really quite able to get over that hump, but still only 32 years old, comes in at 7-5, but has not fought for nearly 2 years. And I was within the first, I think... It was within the first 2 months that I started capping fights that I picked this one, and I believe it was 273 was the card after my infamous UFC Columbus day that vaulted me into the run of success that has spurned the rest of my betting career. And I had been on a huge run of correct picks at that point, and then his fight with Malo was the one that snapped me, because I took the +2.5 in that one, thinking that Gall, as the more experienced UFC guy, in spite of the fact that I could see most of his wins were against there was a big discrepancy in competition that he had. Thought he'd be able to drag out that fight with Malo, given Malo's relatively inexperienced run compared to Gall in the UFC, at least. That didn't end up being the case. And I was able to enjoy a bit of success on Malo in subsequent fights. And although I did grade Magny to beat him, but stayed away from that one, and it'll be killing me that I didn't decide to just go with my gut and play Magny there. What a call that would have been. I think over a +300 at least underdog Magny was for that one in Canada. Regardless, though, I have to... This is a fight where I totally recognize multiple things that could be out of alignment with my analysis relative to what, the eye test or reality is saying. Because for one thing, if Gall wasn't carrying the amount of ring rust that he went, granted, Hafez has nearly not competed for a year, so he's coming into this with his own amount of ring rust, but Gall's is still nearly, or basically or almost 2.5 times more than what Hafez is bringing into this one. And if the ring rust were consistent here, I would have Gall slightly favored to win. And I know that is just not correct relative to what, both of these guys have demonstrated. Hafez losing a split decision to Della Maddalena is a more impressive performance than anything that Gall has demonstrated in the UFC. All of this guy's wins, except for a unanimous decision win over Salim Touahri in 2019, and Touahri has not competed since losing that fight and didn't win any of his appearances in the UFC. They've all been, first or early second round submission wins. The best performance that Gall had was that big upset win over Sage Northcutt, which I think if you reline and rerun that fight now, Northcutt is probably favored and probably ends up getting the better of Gall, particularly with the layoff that Gall has had. In spite of the fact that Northcutt obviously had his UFC run cut shorter than what many were expecting at the young age that he fought Gall at back in 2016. The other things to consider here, I think, are the fact that Hafez has never been finished. Gall's never been submitted, but has been knocked out twice, and his damage tolerance was kind of called into question in that Mike Mallow fight in which he got knocked out in the first round. He had previously also gotten knocked out against Diego Sanchez, who I believe even 5 years ago, Sanchez is 42 now, so he would have been something like 37 at the time that he fought Mickey Gall and was still able to find a knockout win in that fight. That was all the way back at UFC 235, which was headlined by John Jones and Anthony Smith, which feels like, even though it was only 5 years ago, feels like a lifetime ago, I think, for some MMA fans at this point. So in terms of just kind of figuring where this is going to go, I mean, Gall's already clearly proven to be submission or bust. Any time, with some rare exceptions, that you see someone that's made it to the UFC without any knockout wins in their MMA career, that really sticks out as a red flag. The lone exceptions are for guys that live off of club and subs, which was someone who Renato Moicano was for a very long time. It's kind of amazing in hindsight that Moicano's first knockout win of his MMA career was Jailton Turner. And there was a moment during that fight even where Moicano would have lost if Turner hadn't just tried to go for a walk-off KO and had actually attempted to finish that fight at the end of the first round. Now, conversely, Hafez, before that Jack Della Maddalena fight, his fight right before that, not 3 months, but about 5 months prior in February of last year, that was the first knockout win of his MMA career, despite fighting since 2016. Now, it was a one-punch knockout victory, which I think is the one thing that gives me some concern here relative to the knockout threat in this fight against Mickey Gall. But that also happened in the last 90 seconds of that fight in which he faced Evan Cutts, who was an opponent that he actually lost a split decision to 2 years prior to that fight. So that fight ended up being a rematch, and he got a knockout win in the last 90 seconds of their rematch. So perhaps showcase some improvement. But this is also a guy who has been to 5 split decisions in his MMA career across 8 times that he's gone the distance. So I think it's, especially with how that fight with Della Maddalena went, where he did kind of fade, even though he was able to get enough takedown success to keep Della Maddalena on the mat. The wrestling success is there, but the ability to put, aesthetically pleasing damage from the judge's perspective in congruence with that control, I think is still a little bit in question. Because if it had been more pronounced, I think he might have been able to get a more favorable decision in that Della Maddalena fight. Obviously, JDM ended up making much more of an impression on the feet and was favorably rewarded for that, even though I still think Hafez should have been rewarded for a victory in that fight. But because of that, questionable damage output, I think that this line is still considerably wide. I don't think, as I said, even if the ring rust were consistent here, it would be easy for me to look at this and say Gall, I think that Gall's being disrespected by the line and might be worth an underdog play. But when you put it further into context that this guy doesn't have any knockout wins and he's facing a guy that's never been finished, that's going to presumably have a better wrestling advantage on him, and you take the old adage of position over submission, you just have to wonder what Gall's path to victory is here. Maybe he ends up reversing Hafez on the ground if Hafez gasses in the second half of the fight. Maybe he's able to get a few submission attempts in on Hafez without finishing him, and this ends up as another weird split in a fight that certainly isn't lined to be anything close to that. So I think the safer play here is to take the plus 2.5 rounds. Earlier, most of the submission wins that Gall has had came in the first half of his MMA career. If you look at the sample of fights that these guys have had since 2017, most of them have gone to decision. And I think that it's interesting that given these fighters only have one win by knockout between them, which is the far more likelihood for an outcome in an MMA fight than a submission, it's interesting that the plus 2.5 rounds here is lined as close as it is to a pick'em. It's still like minus 135, so there's a little bit of juice, but it's just interesting to see that it's that close given the lack of a knockout threat coming back from one side and the very faint threat of a knockout from the other, and the fact that neither of these guys have ever been submitted, and in one case one of them has never been finished, and the one that's never been finished is the overwhelming favorite. I don't think the knockout threat for Hafez is as strong. I think that if he hadn't had that knockout win over Evan Cutts prior to getting to the UFC, that it would be even less pronounced. But I just wonder about his ability to actually do enough damage to get Gall out of there. Malo had proven to be a bit of a front runner in the sense that he was going to be, if he enjoyed, I think he was lined as like a 2 or 3 to 1 favorite at least when he faced Gall. But it was, Gall's had performances where he's gone the distance with good fighters prior to this. Went to a decision with Randy Brown in 2017, went to a decision with Mike Perry, went to a decision with Alex Morono in the fight prior to his performance against Malo. So this has proven to be a guy that can survive going the distance. And I think that's largely what's going to happen here. I expect Hafez to rack up control time, but Gall to just kind of play it safe and not really give Hafez a window in order to find a submission and hold on to his never having been submitted record. And I don't trust Hafez to do enough damage on the ground to where it compromises Gall, given the fact that we didn't see that kind of output against him when he fought against Jack Della Maddalena. So I really like the plus 2.5 rounds here at the odds that it's at. I'm going to be nervous to make it a leg, and I kind of hope I don't have to. I'd rather lean on like a 4-leg parlay of a lot of the juicier favorites that I'm confident in this week. But I still think that the better play for this fight is to rely on fights goes the distance at the odds that it's at, and that there's good value here, just given the fact that the knockout threat is not super high, and that the submission threat, even though it looks more likely, is heavily discounted by the fact that neither of these guys have ever been submitted in their MMA career. So I think Hafez wins a pretty clear decision, but I have it graded pretty slim, ever slightly in favor of Hafez, but I recognize that you really got to put a greater deal of context into this than what the numbers are just telling you might happen based on not only the small sample that Hafez has only on that Jack Della Maddalena fight, but also the much longer tenure of Mickey Gall, in contrast to the fact that this guy still doesn't have a knockout win in his MMA career, and the large portion of his submission success came in the first half of his MMA career, which, he hasn't competed in 2 years. So it's tough to get a sense of what kind of fighter we're going to see in there Saturday night. But I think that he ends up relying on his experience surviving to the final bell once again, and that this is the first unanimous decision for Hafez in over 4 years. So give me Bassil Hafez to win a 30-27, possibly even a 30-26, but for Gall to not put himself in any compromising positions, particularly on the ground. The next fight is Alex Morono and Niko Price. Morono last competed a couple months ago at UFC Fight Night Alan Curtis 2. I made his fight with Court McGee a parlay leg that night, thinking that it was going to go to decision, and I took the plus 2.5 rounds, which was much like the fight I just discussed, suspiciously lined close to a pick'em in a way that did not make a lot of sense to me, given the tendency for both fighters to try to kind of point fight to a decision, on top of the fact that McGee had a pretty enormous layoff. And even though Morono stung McGee in the opening sequence of the fight, never really turned up the juice to the point where a finish was going to manifest itself. Did attempt a pretty deep guillotine in the second round, but McGee had never been submitted, and his submission defense held up in that one, as it often does for fighters as they get up there in age. McGee in his late 30s at this point, and hasn't been submitted and probably won't likely be, I don't think, in his MMA career. It's the one area that tends to improve lifetime for MMA fighters as they get into the more advanced stages of their career. Submission defense, McGee was able to pop his head out, control the second round entirely, and I think make things a little bit nerve-wracking for Morono bettors, who was a pretty comfortable favorite, I believe, in that matchup. Made me feel great about my plus 2.5 rounds pick after McGee got his head out of that submission attempt, and did end up going to decision, but Morono ended up winning comfortably in 29-28 fashion. Surprisingly, that was the first decision win for Morono across his last his 4 appearances prior or after facing Matthew Semmelsberger. He had 3 decision wins straight prior to that run of 4 fights, one of which was over the fighter we just talked about, Mickey Gall. Price, by comparison, we haven't seen him in nearly a year, and last got knocked out in a fight where I took the under on rounds, thinking Price was probably going to get the better of Lawler in the second round in a similar fashion to how Brian Barberena did. And that ended up being one of my favorite cashes of 2023. Not just because, I had that as one of the legs on a 3-leg parlay, that under 2.5 rounds that night. And it wasn't only because I believe Jesus Aguilera knocked out Shannon Ross with 1 punch in 18 seconds that same night, but also because, as they said on the call, these fairy tale endings don't happen in MMA, and Robbie Lawler got one, and it was really, really great to see. So it was, for my parlay to cash with that happening for a feel-good end for that fight, and to correctly hedge off of a pick that I wasn't confident in, that I had more confidence in the fight ending early and to be rewarded for that. Just great all-around feeling. And that pay-per-view, UFC 290, is what started the run of success for me across the last, 11 or so pay-per-views now, where I think I'm up something like 88 units or 63 units. So it was really great to see. I did back Price. I had him graded ever slightly to win over Rowe, Phil Rowe, in his previous fight at the Fight Night Thompson Holland, and he ended up getting largely outclassed, but showed a bit of a backbone going into that third round, where he had Rowe in some compromising moments because Rowe didn't entirely get him out of there, and Rowe's obviously faded in pretty much every other fight he's ever had that's gone that long, but wasn't able to get Rowe out on the ground. Rowe was able to stand back up and did enough damage where he finally got the better of Price and got him out of there. So I think it's important to contextualize where Price is relative to that win he had over Cowboy Oliveira in 2021, because he had that win over Cowboy Cerrone overturned the year prior, and at that point Cowboy Cerrone had already been on a 4-fight losing streak that included the doctor stoppage against Tony Ferguson, first-round knockouts to both Justin Gaethje and Conor McGregor in McGregor's long-anticipated return, then lost a unanimous decision to Anthony Pettis. At that point, Cowboy Cerrone was kind of already on the supreme decline in his career, and Price still ended up getting that win overturned because of his second busting for cannabis. Make that of you will now, given the regulation around that has changed a little bit. Some people I've seen this week remark on the fact that he doesn't smoke outright anymore, so make of that what you will. But you take that win off the table, and then you watch the Cowboy Oliveira fight, and that fight was even going into the final round, and it seemed like Oliveira was having a little bit more success on the feet than Price was having. But Oliveira made a critical mistake in the final minute of the third round that was pretty close, that he also made in the first round, in which he got into a bit of a tie-up with Price, and Price was kind of able to get not necessarily a headlock, but a high grip that he was able to use to trip Oliveira onto the floor and then keep him on the ground and do enough damage in the closing sequence of the fight to make an impression on the judges, where he got the third round outright. If Cowboy Oliveira didn't make that mistake, there's a world in which that fight is at least a split decision and Price ends up losing that. And then you're looking at a situation where Price doesn't have a win in the UFC since 2019. As it stands, his only win in the last 5 years in the UFC is over a fighter that's no longer on the roster and has taken multiple losses outside of the UFC since leaving. Then you pair that with the context that Morono was getting the better of Price when they fought in 2017, and Morono kind of just got caught and ended up losing that one. But again, there was the big factor in that Price, did get busted for cannabis use, and that, the big reason that they don't like you, they bust you for the cannabis use, is because it shuts off that signal in your brain that you've kind of, suffered too much damage. Not entirely, but it greatly aids in that aspect. And given the attrition Price was suffering against Morono in that fight, you wonder if he had been clean, what kind of an effect would it have had? And at that point when they fought, Price was undefeated and had not ever been finished in his MMA career. He's since been submitted by Vicente Luque and knocked out by Abdul Razak Al Hassan and Jeff Neal, and then knocked out in 2 of his last appearances, and has suffered 5 knockouts in total since losing to Morono, on top of the submission to Vicente Luque, and then getting doctor stopped against Luque again in the fight before he faced Cerrone. Now, Morono had been knocked out and had a, questionable chin prior to fighting Price. But that fight I still think came in, I think it closed as a pick'em. Price was like a minus 105 underdog. But you see, in spite of the fact that Price won the first fight, even if it was ultimately put into a no contest, Morono is still going into this as a minus 250 favorite. And I think that's very appropriate given the fighter that Morono has kind of evolved into in the UFC. It's also important to recognize that when that fight happened in 2017, it was only Price's second UFC appearance and Morono's third. So the jury was still very much out on both guys in terms of what kind of a fighter they were going to turn into and how their UFC careers were going to go. Price enjoyed inconsistent success after those fights. Morono, a bit of a similar story. But the trend that has emerged for Morono, which I think ages much more gracefully for him this time around, is that you see a guy who is comfortable point fighting and has, even though both guys have pretty consistent final round success rates, Price is someone that gets lauded for his cardio a lot, even though he hasn't really gone late into fights that often. Morono has nearly 5 times as many trips to it, over 5 times as many trips to decisions in his MMA career as Price does. And so I think when you combine the fact that he has so much more final round experience than Price does, with the fact that we haven't seen Price in nearly a year, and we just saw Morono fight only a handful of months ago, it's hard to imagine Price starting out sharp enough where Morono is going to end up dropping the first round. And as long as, even if Price ends up having more success on the feet in the second round, I just see too easily, given the late round experience Morono has, Morono being able to make adjustments where he's able to mitigate Price's volume and make more of an impression down the stretch to get a 29-28 win. If Morono loses the first round, I'll be very surprised and concerned. Won't feel super great about him being able to turn things around in the second round, but the common trend that we see for fighters that have had as long of a layoff as Price is they're kind of slow to start getting back in there. And even though he is going to have a 4-inch reach advantage, I think that the attrition that he's suffered at this point is just too much for a guy like Morono to not be able to make reads and adjustments on and take advantage of. So even though I would say Price has a bit more finishing upside here, especially given how the first fight shook out, I think it's too easy to point to a world where Morono gets a 29-28 decision, particularly based on how the first fight was going prior to Price just getting one good shot that was able to get Morono out of there towards the end of the second round, where the line feels appropriate to me here. So I think Morono gets a pretty comfortable 29-28 decision here. I wouldn't be surprised to see a 30-27. I don't want to outright say Niko Price's shot at this point, but I'm surprised that, given it was announced a few hours before I started recording this that Nick Diaz will be on the UFC Abu Dhabi card in August. I'm surprised that they didn't hold off on matchmaking Niko Price here to give him that fight. Even though I recognize, I think Morono took this as a bit of a late replacement, but I think that's something important to consider too, is that this is even though again, it's a no contest, this is a fight that Morono lost when it happened in 2017, and Morono's confident enough to step up and take this on short notice at a time where he's trying to build back momentum in his career after the disappointing loss to Ponzinibbio and a subsequent disappointing performance against Buckley. It is also, I think, important to point out that Tim Means got the first round over Morono when they fought, and Morono kind of needed to bail himself out with a guillotine in the second round of that fight. I don't really see Price making a similar mistake in terms of shooting into one of those, just because we don't really see a lot of takedowns from him at this point. People, especially the commentary likes to make a point that Price is a big volume fighter, but it's him throwing a lot of 1-2s. It's not as many sophisticated combos in terms of, piling on 3 or 4 strikes in one sequence as we have seen for Morono. And I think that's going to make a big difference here too. So I don't expect Morono to get his first knockout win since the one that he got over Cowboy Cerrone in 2021. But I do think that there's enough of how these two have seen their UFC careers played out relative to the attrition, the much more that Price has suffered, and the far more considerable experience that Morono has going into the final rounds of fights, and the layoff that Price has relative to what Morono is dealing with, that I just expect Morono to be sharper and for that to carry him through to the distance and for him to do a better job of implementing his game plan. So give me Alex Morono by unanimous decision. The next fight is Jake Matthews and Phil Rowe. This is a very intriguing fight because both of these guys are very, very difficult to cap. Matthews enters 19-7. His last appearance was in November in a fight I faded him against when he faced Michael Morales, a fighter I'm very, very high on. I had previously not had any success capping a Matthews appearance, whether backing or fading him, so it was finally nice to get that result correct. I previously faded him against Andre Fialho, and he rather dominated Fialho and as many like to say, fraud-checked Fialho in that one. And then took him against Semmelsberger in what remains one of the most frustrating picks I've had, just because Matthews was lined as a minus 300 favorite and largely won the fight outside of the 3 knockdowns he conceded to Semmelsberger. Probably would have won the fight if he hadn't given up a knockdown to Semmelsberger at the very end of the second round when they fought. And even though he got knocked down at the start of the third round, he still made enough of an impression on 2 of the judges' scorecards to take the third round in that fight and make it a 29-28 unanimous decision loss. So very, very frustrating performance. Didn't have a pick against Flowers because I believe Flowers was a short notice replacement. And then against Michael Morales, I felt good enough to fade him at that, even though I believe Morales was a comfortable favorite. So we're back to seeing Matthews as a favorite, to the surprise of many, and I can understand why. Rowe's going to have a pretty significant size advantage here, which he does over most of his opponents. But there's a lot of things that, I said Rowe is going to have the size advantage, right? Either way. Rowe enters 10-4. I faded him in his fight against Neil Magny, in which he lost a split decision that he at one point was like a minus 200 live odds favorite, I think, at one point in the second round. But you could tell very early on he was just way too eager to engage in fence clinches with Neil Magny, which is what Magny's world is. I don't think he was really comfortable facing a fighter that kind of offered the same length that he usually enjoys over his opponents. Didn't really know what to do with himself. And showed at the beginning of the end of the first round, rather, by like kind of dropping his guard and flexing on Magny a bit, that he didn't really respect what was coming back to him and kind of just let himself go in that fight in a way where Magny was able to tie things up and put it back on his own terms and make enough of an impression to get a split decision. That was Fight Night Emmett Topuria when I had my first clean sweep on the public record with MMA Rax. So that was nice to see. I was a little bit nervous about how the judges were going to see that, but I did think Magny did enough to win that one. It was one of those split decisions where none of the judges score any of the third rounds unanimously. So there was a world in which you could have seen that fight 30-27 for Phil Rowe, but Magny, I thought, just did too much of a good job of making that fight bizarre on the fence and getting enough control time to where Rowe really didn't get to make much of an impression with the striking outside of the first round. And the fight prior to that, as I spoke to in the earlier pick, he did get the better of Niko Price in a fight where I just barely took Price to win. Did kind of let it get away from him in the third, but was able to get back to his feet and rally back and knock out Price in the second half of that final round. That fight was mandatory viewing, I think, if you're a capper this week, given both fighters are on this card. So anybody that didn't watch Price Rowe recently, if they admitted as much to you and are giving you betting advice, you should wag the finger at them a little bit. But this is just because both of these guys are kind of tricky to cap, I think this is a really difficult one to call. Rowe doesn't really have one punch lights out power. All three of his knockouts in the UFC have been in, if not the second half of fights outright. The only one that he had that didn't extend in the second half of a fight was against Jason Witt, but Jason Witt was kind of old and already chinny at that point. It's kind of surprising it wasn't able to get him out of there earlier than he did. But Rowe is much more of a builder and someone that just kind of leans on his length and size to put attrition-based damage on his opponents rather than kind of overextending and just really stinging somebody early on in the fights. Matthews, even though he has just one win by knockout in his UFC career, and it's the one that he had over Andre Fialho, I wouldn't say that he has more finishing upside in this one just because Rowe's going to enjoy a 6.5-inch reach advantage, or actually a 7.5-inch reach advantage, which is a highly significant reach advantage, as well as 4 inches of height. But for the people that are showing concern in Jake Matthews' chin, even though he's been knocked out the same amount of times that Rowe has, I would just caution that Rowe got knocked down multiple times in his unanimous decision loss to Gabe Green, which is a loss that really has not aged well. And the best win that he's had at this point in his career is that not really a comeback, but a fight that he let get away from him in certain respects down the stretch against Niko Price that he then had to turn around to find victory in that final round. If that fight had gone to a decision, he did enough work in the first 10 minutes that it would have been the first decision win of his career. But Rowe still at this point has not won a fight by decision period in his MMA career. And you see a guy like Matthews just has a lot more success going the distance, even though he hasn't won a fight by decision himself since he faced Diego Sanchez about 4 years ago. And his prior wins over decision aren't necessarily great, outside of one that has aged very gracefully against Li Jingliang. So Rowe still hasn't lost by submission in his career, although I see people that are backing Rowe this week are saying that they think that he can win by guillotine, and I don't really understand how, based on what these two guys have proven and the wealth of UFC experience that Matthews has in comparison to Rowe, over 3 times more at this stage, it's bizarre to me that people are saying that Rowe would have the submission upside in this fight over Matthews. I just don't think that that's an accurate read at all. So I do think the fight is lined appropriately upon looking into it a bit further. I was kind of hopeful at a glance when I first saw the numbers that I was going to be backing Rowe here. But the further I got looking into it, the more I just realized that there's enough IQ concerns with what Rowe has demonstrated in his recent performances that given both of these guys are risky, and in most cases you'd rather take the guy with plus odds, especially when they're going to have the size advantages Rowe has, there's enough of a concern with Rowe's lack of experience going the distance and his lack of success when he has gone the distance that makes me think that Matthews has a very, very good path to victory here if he can avoid getting finished in the first half of this fight. So I expect Rowe to enjoy a good amount of success in the early stages, but I would expect as he kind of starts to fade and maybe gets a little bit overconfident by winning the first round, that Matthews is maybe able to land a takedown in the second round that kind of lets him put the fight into where he wants it on the ground, and then just kind of build from there and ultimately take over down the stretch to where he's able to get a 29-28 decision win. So I can understand why people like Phil Rowe as an underdog this week. I just think that after, taping him again and seeing what happened across his last two performances, he's too willing to fall into what his opponent wants to do as opposed to keeping things on his own terms. And also for a guy, and this is a criticism that I had of Trey Waters going into the Billy Goff fight as well, that for how tall the guy is, it's another guy who enjoys big length advantages in terms of height and reach in most of his fights at welterweight, does not implement kicks enough. Maybe shows great kicks, but does not put them into practice enough to where they would make as much of a difference. You would like to see someone with the kind of length and reach that Rowe enjoys getting off more kicks, low leg kicks and kicks and stepping knees generally than what Rowe has actually shown. He's just too comfortable to lean on his boxing that is usually supported by the reach advantage he usually enjoys. And even though that may work against a fighter that has suffered a great deal of knockout-based attrition like a Niko Price, when you take away the reach advantage, you see the kind of frustration that he falls into against someone like Neil Magny, or when he faces someone that has more demonstrable power and a more well-rounded MMA game like Gabe Green, you see how that ends up resulting in him dropping fights that end up going the distance. So it's possible he ends up getting an early finish on Matthews here. I wouldn't put it out of the question. But Matthews, the only two times he's ever been finished in his MMA career in the first round were James Vick in 2015 and Kevin Lee in 2016. So I think that Matthews has at least matured enough as a veteran at this point, in spite of the fact that he's 4 years younger than Rowe, because again, he still has over 3 times as much experience in the UFC, that Matthews is going to do a better job of fighting the game plan that he wants and getting to his most obvious path to victory, which is extending this fight and making it go the distance, than Rowe is going to be able to at keeping the fight on his terms, especially if he's not able to get a finish within the first 5 minutes. So the longer this goes, the more I like this for Jake Matthews. I do think he extends this and ends up, getting he's been in this seesaw pattern of win-loss going back to the Diego Sanchez fight in 2020. He's on a loss now. I think that he flips it back into the win column. I do see Rowe suffering the first losing streak of his MMA career since his first 2 fights happened. And I think Matthews ends up taking this 29-28 after dropping the first round. So give me Jake Matthews to win by unanimous decision, possibly a split depending on how the damage ends up shaking out. but I think that he makes enough of an impression in the final 10 minutes and leans on his experience, both going the distance and in the UFC, enough that he's able to find victory here. The next fight is Grant Dawson and Joe Solecki. Dawson was a minus 400 favorite against Bobby Green back at his first UFC Fight Night headline appearance in October of last year, and suffered one of the betting upsets of the year after Bobby Green knocked him out in the first minute. Solecki was, I believe, I can't remember if he was a favored or not over Jakar Close, but obviously came out on the losing end of, it was a pick'em, and he was a slight underdog when it closed. But I was backing Solecki in that fight, and was on the losing end of what was like the 14th, I think, slam KO in UFC history. That was immediately followed up by must have inspired Cody Brundage to do the same thing to Zach Reese. That's who he was fighting in the fight after that. So we got the 14th and 15th slam KOs in UFC history, and that fight just kind of showed how Solecki was just way, way, way too willing to not only fight off of his back, but hold on for dear life to competing via his jiu-jitsu acumen, and just kind of, I got put out pretty badly against Jakar Close in one of the last fight nights the UFC put on last year. So he comes back 6 months later. I think that's enough time off from a KO, even one as bad as getting slammed into the mat head first like that. Same can be said about Dawson's KO, which was the second loss by knockout he suffered in his MMA career, the second one inside of a minute, but the first one to arrive in the UFC. This fight earlier in the week, when I advocated staying away from it, Dawson was like a minus 300 favorite, and he's since ballooned out to over 500 at some books. And I understand why, because the similar to talking about this is a more, I think, a bit of a higher level version of the Hafez Gall matchup from earlier in the card, in which you've got one fighter that the favorite does not have a lot of knockout upside and has submission acumen to match their wrestling acumen, where the opponent has also very limited knockout upside and almost entirely relies on their submission accolades and acumen with not much else to offer back, and is presumably going to be fighting off of their back against someone that's better at obtaining position for most of the fight. I think that it's largely going to play out in similar fashion to how Hafez Gall does, where Dawson just kind of smothers him on his way to a 30-27 decision. But it only takes one mistake from Dawson to find himself in a compromised position to Solecki, and Solecki potentially capitalizing on that for a finish. The line was already, I think, kind of wide, just given the limited knockout upside of both of these guys. And I don't like, even though neither one of them have ever been submitted, I think that the likelihood that Dawson does end up giving Solecki his first submission loss is pretty high here. But it's like I said, it just takes one early mistake, which is the same kind of early mistake that Dawson committed against Green, albeit Green, was presumably going to have the striking upside in that fight. But Dawson even said, if you go back to their face-off, Dawson straight up told him, I'm just going to lay on you for 25 minutes. And Green never even let it get past one. So it was evident in that one that Green was going to have the upside on the feet and that the line was lined a little bit too wide. I don't think Solecki presents nearly as much of a threat for Dawson in that respect. And this does feel like a spot where they're trying to get a bounce back spot for Dawson. Yeah, I don't really see how Solecki is going to be able to get a path to victory here outside of a mistake from Dawson. But at the same time, I hate how wide this line is, that I wouldn't feel comfortable playing Grant Dawson at the money line that he is. So yeah, pretty quick breakdown for me. I don't really have a lot to say about this one that I didn't really similarly point out in the Hafez Gall fight, although I think that Dawson has more finishing upside in this one than Hafez has against Gall, which is reflected in the fact that the line is kind of ballooned out to where it is. I still expect this to be a pretty boring performance where Dawson just smothers for 15 minutes and gets a 30-27, possibly a 30-26. But it would be very funny to see Solecki kind of turn the tables at one point and maybe get a reversal of position to where, he's able to take Dawson's back and kind of give him a bit of a scary moment. So, to Solecki's credit, he did in what I think was probably his most, the highest level opponent he's fought outside of close. He did go to a split decision against Jared Gordon, so maybe he is able to make this a bit more interesting than people are giving him credit for. But in spite of the fact that he grades out as the more accurate striker and presumably takes less damage, there's just not, based on absorbed strikes, I still think that Dawson is going to be ahead of him in the striking, particularly where volume is concerned. But it'll be interesting if Solecki is able to kind of shoot and gain his own position, if he's able to retain that, or if Dawson just ends up sweeping and totally outclassing him and writing that out for each round. So it's just difficult for me to see a lot of paths to success here for Solecki where Dawson doesn't have him covered. I understand why the line has moved the way it has. I still wouldn't play it. And I don't quite feel comfortable enough at the price that the over 2.5 rounds is at like minus 200, where I would play that, given I do think there's considerable risk that Dawson ends up giving Solecki the first loss of his MMA career by submission, probably via rear naked choke. So give me Grant Dawson to win by unanimous decision, but I wouldn't go anywhere near this fight from a betting perspective. The next fight is Roman Kopylov and Cesar Almeida. Kopylov enters 12-3 after after serving as one of the key fades on my clean sweep at UFC 298, in which I figured Anthony Fluffy Hernandez was going to have the more well-rounded MMA game and be able to break Kopylov's solid takedown defense and hand him his second submission loss in his MMA career, which is exactly what happened. Fluffy actually had moments where he appeared to get the better of Kopylov on the feet, striking-wise, which was surprising. Although one judge did give Kopylov the first round against Hernandez, which I didn't really have a problem with. I thought it was a pretty close first round, even though I was obviously advocating for Hernandez. But Fluffy finally got the better of him in the second round in the takedowns, and after getting on his back, it was a wrap. I did enjoy that moment where Kopylov appeared to sting him a little bit, at least early in the second round. Fluffy just kind of flipped him off like, nah, we brawling, let's go. So I wonder how much that kind of got into Roman at that point, but he, I thought he still put on a pretty decent performance for being a comfortable underdog in that one. But but prior to that, I faded him I think I advocated to stay away from the Josh Friend fight. I think I did. I can't remember. I think I did pick Claudio Ribeiro as a big underdog against him, although I might have advocated for a stay away in that fight too. But I definitely did pick Punahele Soriano when he was favored to beat Kopylov. I also picked Alessio Di Chirico to beat him as well. And both of those ended up being not very accurate reads at all. So Kopylov was someone I had struggled for a while to get behind. And given the success that he had on that 4-fight win streak that was all knockouts, I was kind of waiting eagerly for the day that I was going to kind of be in agreement with the market that this is the time to go with him. Cesar Almeida, conversely, someone I faded against Dylan Budka at Fight Night Alan Curtis 2, as many did. Budka was the favorite going into that, and both guys came in relatively inexperienced, but most people thought the more well-rounded MMA game of Budka was going to result in him out wrestling and controlling Almeida, even though Almeida in his Contender Series appearance against Lucas Fernando, in which he was a very comfortable underdog, showed really excellent ability to return to his feet after being taken down, and not only get back to his feet, but also reverse position. He had his back taken at one point, I think, in the first round, and was able to kind of, spin out of it to where he was able to regain top control and then kind of employ his own effective ground and pound and kind of steal the round back from Fernando. So, and then from there, he just totally dominated the rest of the fight. Against Budka, he did lose the first round unanimously, which I thought was accurate, and there's many people that will throw a fit and say that it was ridiculous that that Almeida wasn't given the first round based on damage, despite the fact that both of them only landed one significant strike, and all of the other strikes that Almeida landed were from him getting clinched on the fence. Those are not significant strikes. Those are just total strikes, and the clinch on the fence is usually the rarest position that you see someone get finished in a fight to begin with. So I did think that Budka deserved to win that first round based on control, but obviously gassed himself out trying to employ that game plan over 3 rounds to where Almeida was able to take advantage. But we still haven't really seen Almeida have the kind of standing success on the feet over these first 2 appearances that he's had that translates to this kickboxing marvel that people are claiming him to be. Did you guys know, by the way, that he had a win over Alex Pereira in kickboxing? I haven't heard a single person. I've heard that shit has driven me fucking crazy hearing that all week and going back into the fight over Budka. I haven't heard a single person make the point that that fight happened 10 years ago when Almeida was 26 and Pereira would have been, what, 25, 24? Like, if you have those two fight today at middleweight in the UFC, what do you think the line on that fight is going to be? It's ridiculous that people would point across to that promote, particularly, and look, I pride myself on being an enlightened casual for this sport, okay? For all the betting success and good reads I've had, and, I have plenty of reads that aren't accurate too, I'm not going to pretend that my reads or grip on wrestling or kickboxing or grappling, any other combat sport, is anywhere close to what I understand about MMA at this point, in spite of the fact that it's the sport that blends all of those elements together, okay? But based on people that I've listened to that are more enlightened in those areas, kickboxing is such a fractured sport from a promotional standpoint that almost anybody can claim to be world class or a world champion. I mean, look at Dustin Jacoby's kickboxing accolades prior to coming into the UFC, and how did that translate when he fought Alonzo Menefield or Khalil Roundtree? Granted, I think that he beat Roundtree, and I picked him to beat Roundtree, but it just shows you that MMA is a different sport, even when you end up in a fight where nearly all of it just takes place on the feet, in a wheelhouse that you would think the kickboxer would be able to excel at. In fact, I think about that fight that Jacoby had against Anzat Murkanov. I'm not saying the guy's name right, but the Russian, the short, 5'9" light heavyweight that was lined as an underdog, that Jacoby really ended up getting dominated in that fight pretty much and totally taken out of, to the point that he was desperately shooting takedowns across the last like 3 rounds, even though Murkanov never really went out of his way to shoot them to begin with. He had the better gotten of him by that guy in that fight, in spite of the fact that there wasn't much of a takedown threat. So you can't just look at a fight that is presumably going to stay standing and think, oh, this guy's going to do better because he's got so much of his experience in another sport to rely on. It's just, how often do we look at guys that are jiu-jitsu aces and say that they're going to just dominate in the grappling in one fight, and then they totally get the better of them? Like, a great example was Fluffy Hernandez against Rodolfo Vieira. You can't just look at someone who has been an ace in one sport and think that is immediately going to translate to MMA in a way that is going to result in consistent success for them, particularly when they're 36 years old. Now, I will say that I've seen the interesting point this week that people think Kopylov might be able to take down Almeida. And I actually think that Almeida at the UFC level has demonstrated a better, more well-rounded MMA game relative to his ability to do damage on the ground than what Kopylov has shown any interest in. Almeida hasn't landed any true takedowns to where it would be him initiating getting that fight on the ground, but his ability to get back to his feet when someone else is trying to put the fight somewhere where he doesn't want to go, and be able to hold up and fight and try to get back to fighting the way he presumably wants to fight, I think has been more impressive than what Kopylov has demonstrated, even though Kopylov has shown really, really good takedown defense, even so against Hernandez, where I think Hernandez went 0 for 8 on his first 8 takedown attempts in that fight. But you look at where these two are in their careers, and again, Almeida's training at Extreme Couture relative to, I'm not sure what Jim Kopylov is training at. I know that he at least trains at Elevation, which, speaks to good things for the fact that he's kind of a builder in terms of doesn't overexert himself early and then really starts to let his hands go as the fight goes on, which is why he only has 1 first-round finish despite 11 of his 12 wins coming by knockout. Kopylov is a builder. Almeida, I think the more well-rounded game is supported by the fact that he trains at Extreme Couture. But again, we haven't seen him put out the sophisticated, 3, 4, 5 punch combos in the UFC across his first 2 appearances the way that we've seen Kopylov do. Kopylov's demonstrated great speed across that time. Is kickboxing, grappling, wrestling, sambo. I'm not going to pretend to know the ins and outs of all these other, I don't want to say minor combat sports, but just not as elevated to the platform that MMA has become. But Kopylov is someone that has a lot of world-renowned experience in his own sport that he did prior to lengthening out his MMA career, relative to being a multiple-time Sambo world champion, being on Russia's combat team. This is a guy that has his own accolades beyond in combat sports beyond MMA in his own right, and is at a younger point in his career where he's demonstrated better speed and more sophisticated striking in his time in the UFC, where he has considerably more UFC experience than what we've seen from Almeida. This is a big step up in MMA competition for Almeida, for a guy that has only had 5 MMA fights in his career. And it is surprising to me, given how much hype was around Kopylov going into the Soriano fight as an underdog, and then in his subsequent performances, how much people would speak so highly of his striking that all of a sudden he would get matched up with this guy Almeida. And the only backing I hear about while Almeida should win this fight is because he's a world-class kickboxer that got a win over Alex Pereira 10 years ago. We've seen too many stories of guys that are presumably these world-class athletes in other combat sports that come into the UFC and then face somebody that even when the other areas of MMA don't get implemented, the very fact that there's at least of a threat of those being there creates enough of a discrepancy where they just end up losing fights to people that on paper, they should have otherwise outclassed in their own wheelhouse. I was so happy when I got done taping all of the recent performances for these two that I came out thinking Kopylov was going to win, and then the line flipped. But given my lack of underdogs that I like on this card and plus odds plays, I'm grateful to finally have one. So I will graciously bet Kopylov as an underdog in this fight, as many did when he faced, I believe he was an underdog against Elizeu de Chirico. He was definitely the underdog against Soriano. He was like a 3-1 favorite against Fremd and was definitely the favorite over Ribeiro, but was an underdog against Hernandez too, and had considerable hype as an underdog going into that Hernandez fight. That hype all just evaporated because Fluffy's an animal at middleweight. I don't agree with that whatsoever. I'm very happy to be on the side of Kopylov in this fight, particularly now that the fight is outright flipped from being a pick'em to Kopylov being like a plus 104 favorite at this point. And I'll be picking him to win. I don't know if he knocks out Almeida because I'm not sure Almeida ever suffered a knockout during his kickboxing career. But Kopylov has proven to be enough of a builder that I think he's only going to get better as the fight goes along. And I don't expect Almeida to match up well with the speed that Kopylov is putting out. I think it's possible Almeida holds on long enough that he's able to take the third round away, but I think Kopylov does enough work in the first 10 minutes that he's able to get a 29-28 decision win here. I think it'll be a close fight. I think it's going to be an entertaining and pretty good case for fight of the night, but I still expect Kopylov's better UFC experience and better speed at this point and more sophisticated combos to make enough of an impression here that the power that Almeida has just isn't going to make enough of a difference. Even if he's able to deploy leg kicks in the way that people are thinking is going to happen because Kopylov's a southpaw. Almeida, even though he can fight out of both stances, is still listed as an orthodox fighter. And him getting matched up against a southpaw is just going to make things more complicated for him making his reads in a way that Kopylov, I think, is just going to be able to more reliably tee off prior to Almeida making that read and that change. So give me Kopylov to win here, and I'm grateful that he's an underdog. The next fight is Randy Brown and Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos. Brown enters 18-5 after arguably the most impressive win of his UFC career so far back in February, in which he knocked out Muslim Salikov in the first round. That was only the second loss by knockout in Salikov's MMA career after retiring, or I don't know if retiring is the right word, but earning distinguishment as the greatest Chinese kickboxer, wushu kickboxer of all time. So again, another example, as we just talked about in Kopylov Almeida, of a guy who has a lot of success in another sport, not necessarily seeing that translate into MMA consistently. Granted, Salikov did, go into that fight. I think he was like 39 years old at that point. But it's worth pointing out, too, that when he fought Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos, who comes into this fight 24-7 after earning a draw against Renat Fakhretdinov back in November in Brazil, when Zaleski dos Santos fought Salikov 3 fights prior to that one, losing a split decision, Zaleski dos Santos did almost finish Salikov at the end of what I believe was the second round. That fight kind of played out similarly to Solikov's fight with Li Jingliang, in which Solecki was doing a good job of kind of outpointing Leach, but Leach ultimately was able to get him with a good shot towards the end of the second where his chin just couldn't hold up at that age, and he ended up falling in defeat in that one. But Zaleski dos Santos wasn't able to get the finish at the end of the second round, and Solecki was able to kind of hold on in the third and was able to win a split decision there. Dos Santos, had he not lost that split, would have been in a position where, outside of his own late knockout loss to Li Jingliang, his only other loss in the UFC was a split decision in his UFC debut to Nicholas Dalby. The best win on his resume, obviously at this point, has to be his head kick knockout over Sean Strickland when Strickland was a welterweight back in 2018, a fight that's aged very gracefully for him. He was on his way to losing to Rinat Fakhretdinov before. You wonder if the heat in Brazil and the blend of, Dos Santos having the Brazilian crowd on his side at Fight Night Almeida Lewis kind of paid dividends for him getting a 10-8 round over Fakhretdinov in what proved to be a comeback tie. But Dos Santos is a guy that I've always kind of looked very favorably upon. His win over Benoit Saint-Denis also stands out as a good win as well back in 2021. I've really only had 2 times where I've been able to put out picks on him. I took the plus 2.5 rounds, I believe, when he fought Abubakar Nurmagomedov in June of last year. That proved to be the correct pick in what was a split decision win for him in a fight that Nurmagomedov, I believe, was favored to win. And then I believe I advocated for a stay away rather than a plus or minus 2.5 rounds when he fought Rinat Fakhretdinov, despite how much I like Fakhretdinov, and that proved to be the correct read as well. I believe I advocated for a stay away when Brown fought Solecki, just because the price on Brown was a little bit too high, I thought. And it ended up being the most impressive win that Brown has had in his UFC career. Because, and this is a point that I'll make later on in the Makhachev-Poirier fight as well. In spite of the fact that Brown has, this outrageous size at welterweight that, fighters like Phil Rowe and Trey Waters also enjoy, although Brown, I think, has much more musculature than both of those guys. I think the other two are a little bit more, ropey or wiry. Brown's, most of his success in the UFC has been much more by grappling. The only KO he had in all of his UFC appearances prior to this one was against Brian Barberena in what was much more of an attrition-based knockout, and also came by way of a kick rather than any of his standing strikes. He was able, in his split decision win over Chaos Williams, he mostly outpointed him in the second round, but he's never been much of a power striker in the way that a guy like Chaos Williams is. He's always been much more of a guy that is going to just kind of try to utilize the most of his length to outpoint you, and is much more savvy, I think, with finding submissions than he is with finding knockouts. That's why the win over Solecki was so impressive, because he was able to, as a guy that hasn't had a lot of knockout success in the UFC, get that one-punch knockout on Solecki in the way that he did and really just turn off the lights with a straight right. So it showed kind of the evolution of Brown's game, even at his age at 33, where fighters are presumably just over a little bit past their prime, or at least getting ready to come out of it. The best version of Randy Brown that we're going to see in his MMA lifetime is the one that's coming into this fight right now. And I don't think you can say the same about Zaleski dos Santos. Even though I don't expect age to play a big role here, despite the fact that dos Santos is 37, there's no 5-year age gap. But what's more interesting is that the striking numbers between these two are largely even. But I don't think Dos Santos has shown power in his UFC career the way that Randy Brown most recently did, that is going to make enough of a difference that he can capitalize on Randy Brown's chin, despite the fact that Brown has suffered one more knockout in his MMA lifetime than Dos Santos has. Brown figures to be a little bit better of a grappler by the numbers. Dos Santos doesn't really shoot a lot of takedowns, and when he does, I mean, I should rephrase. He doesn't land a lot of takedowns. Less than half a takedown landed per 15 minutes in his UFC career, and only lands takedowns at a 13% clip, which is really, really horrible. So given Brown's takedown defense is 74%, which is fairly solid, and he's going to have the ability as the longer and lengthier guy to kind of stand tall up against the fence and make himself difficult to take down and do a good job of retaining his balance. I don't really see this fight going to the ground if Dos Santos wants to put it there. And given the striking is so even on a numbers basis, both offensively and defensively, Brown's going to enjoy a 5-inch reach advantage. He's going to be 4 inches taller. He can fight out of both stances. I expect him to enjoy more success in the striking, particularly with the power that he just exhibited, than what we're going to presumably see from Dos Santos at this point. Again, Dos Santos needed to come back to beat Fakhretdinov, and I wonder how much of the Brazilian environment factored into that, despite the fact that Fakhretdinov is presumably someone that trains at elevation and his cardio didn't really end up holding up. Even though Dos Santos has nearly 2 times as much experience as Brown going the distance, he has not had a lot of success winning fights that have gone that late. In addition to the draw that he most recently had, he's had 4 fights go to split decisions in the UFC, and 2 of those have ended up being losses, his fight with Dalby and his fight with Solecki. So it speaks to inconsistent success in the final round, whereas Randy Brown, I believe the only loss by decision, his only 2 losses by decision in the UFC, he only has 1 loss by decision in the UFC, and it was to Belal Muhammad. In fact, that's the only loss by decision he's had in his MMA career outright. So I don't expect Dos Santos to be able to deploy the same kind of smothering on the ground game plan that Muhammad is able to. And even if Dos Santos does somehow putting this fight on the ground, I would expect Brown to be able to at least find his way back up to his feet, if not get a reversal and kind of be able to do his own good work on the ground outright. And then again, on the feet, there's enough evenness in the striking that you have to believe that the length is going to make the difference for Brown here, on top of the power that he most recently exhibited. So I think this is another fight that goes to a decision. But I wouldn't be surprised if the wheels maybe come off a bit for Dos Santos and Brown is able to earn another early finish by knockout. I don't really see this ending by submission, but I do think that Brown is probably going to end up getting a 29-28 unanimous decision here. I like the price that he's at, given the size advantage that he's going to have coming into this. And I do think that the fact that he has spent, over 2/3 of his MMA career fighting in the UFC, that little bit of more UFC experience that he has over a guy like Dos Santos, despite Dos Santos' own tenure, is going to make a good enough difference where he can rely on outpointing Dos Santos down the stretch, especially if it's 1-1 going into the final round, that Brown's more reliable performance in fights that go the distance makes enough of a difference for him where he's able to get a 29-28. So I do really like the price that he's at, and it's held relatively steady this week. He was minus 162 when I put the pick out. He's now out to minus 175. I'm hoping that doesn't balloon out to 200, but honestly, I still think I would play him at 200 even if it does get out that far. So give me Randy Brown by unanimous decision. The next fight is Jailton Almeida and Alexandr Romanov. Almeida was on his way to beating Curtis Blades before he got way too hung up on securing a double leg in the second round, early in the second round, and ate way too many hammer fists from Blades on the fence at UFC 299 in what was a highly contentious fight among cappers going into that pay-per-view week. Understandable given it was a pick'em, but there were many people fiercely making cases for both fighters, and I made a pretty emphatic one that I thought Blades had kind of met his match in the wrestling department, and I think I was mostly correct. Almeida did have takedown success, even though he wasn't able to really keep Blades on the mat, and did get the first round, I believe, in unanimous fashion from the judges. At 299, it didn't really look like the narrative was going to change that much, but he was just too focused and too locked in on securing that double leg takedown on Blades early in the second, and was too confident in his chin as Blades was just bashing him with hammer fists, and the lack of experience from Almeida fighting at heavyweight proved to be his undoing, and Blades ended up getting a comeback knockout win in that one that has since vaulted Blades into getting a rematch interim title shot against Tom Aspinall. Romanov, by comparison, was a main parlay leg in his last appearance for me at Fight Night Strickland Magomedov last year in July, so 11 months ago to the day that this card will be taking place. He was fighting someone that I had very fiercely faded in just about all of his appearances in Blagoy Ivanov, and I was pretty confident that Romanov was going to show enough of a turnaround that he not only deserved to be the favorite in that one, but was going to get the better of Blagoy in what ended up being Blagoy's, I believe, last appearance with the UFC. And he has since gone to PFL, in which he lost a unanimous decision in his most recent fight. So Romanov is someone that when I started doing this was one of my favorite people that I taped. Just because he showed, it was so obvious that he was a guy that was just a matchup nightmare for so many of the lower tiered opponents in the heavyweight division, which easily has the greatest talent discrepancy between, the contenders in the UFC and the lowest rungs of the division relative to any of the others in the promotion. But it was so obvious that he was going to be able to give problems to even good fighters that just didn't, that had the obvious hole in their ground game, that he was going to be a nightmare for them. That was very much reflected in his second career appearance when he choked out Marcos Rogerio de Lima with his forearm. But at the same time, you could still tell that as the step-ups in competition were happening, as he was probably going to be forced to fight into later stages of rounds where he wasn't able to put his opponents away, he was going to encounter some more turbulence. A lot of people, since that Juan Espino technical split decision fight in which he straight up asked the referee, if I'm too hurt to continue, does it go to technical decision or is it going to be a no contest? That his cardio was going to be a concern. And that ended up very much being the case when he fought Marcin Tybura at Elevation. And then when he came in considerably out of shape against Alexander Volkov in a fight I backed Volkov as an underdog. He's been for some a difficult fighter to cap, but my goodness, he does have just some of the most fun ground and pound in this division. Not only just excellent, you'll see him when he gets to mount deploying these double hammer fists in very much earning him the King Kong nickname, but also a more advanced submission game than I think he gets credit for. He's not just somebody that's relying on rear naked chokes or guillotines, but, being able to just kind of press your forearm on somebody's neck and making them quit, just speaks to not only the ability to get those submissions, but then also really make your opponents feel that pressure and pain in this weight class. I believe he also got Roque Martinez by arm triangle in his MMA debut. So he deserves, I think, a bit more credit for what his submission ability is than he gets credit for. And he also perfect gamed Chase Sherman in what was lined as, there's a lot of people that were talking about Bo Nickel being the heaviest favorite in UFC history. I believe that Romanov actually was in that fight, that he closed at something like a minus 2,500 favorite over Sherman and deserved to be so. Unfortunately, this is just not a good matchup for Romanov. Jailton Almeida is still the fighter that we think he is, in spite of the fact that, what happened against Curtis Blades. And even though I think Romanov demonstrated good developments in his striking against Blagoy Ivanov, Ivanov was not presenting the same takedown threat in this fight that Almeida is just going to put on Romanov. And the biggest glaring concern here obviously is, on top of Almeida averaging nearly 7 takedowns per 15 minutes across his UFC fights, Romanov's takedown defense is horrible at just 20% lifetime for his UFC career. So, given the athlete that we know Almeida is, if he just avoids getting finished on the feet within the first 5 minutes, which is not something we've seen Romanov do yet to anybody in his UFC career, Almeida's going to be able to shoot, get takedowns, and then really put this in his world in a way that I don't really see him getting reversed by Romanov due to the discrepancy in the athleticism. We haven't seen Romanov lose by submission yet in his MMA career. So I don't know if you can feel comfortable playing Almeida by submission here. I think probably it's more realistic that Romanov kind of turtles up and quits after giving up his back, and Almeida's just kind of raining down on him. But I still expect Almeida to get on the ground, do the boa constrictor routine, and advance position far enough where he gets to mount. Romanov is doing what he can to try to reverse, but just isn't able to get out, and ultimately just ends up turtling to strikes in the first half of the fight. I don't like that this line is getting out to close to 300. Earlier in the week, I put Almeida out as a minus 255 favorite, and I do really like him in the 200 range here. I'm going to be very nervous to play him at anything more than that, and unfortunately, he has just barely gotten out to minus 300 at Bet Online, but is still in that second half of 250 to 290 range at most books. So if you can still get him at that price, I think that he's definitely worth that play. At 300, I'll be a little bit concerned that, what if Romanov does end up reversing him? What if he does do enough damage in the first round where again, it's a heavyweight fight. The most volatile division there is. If Romanov does come in decent shape, what happens if he is able to, the striking improvements that we saw against Ivanov throughout the 3 rounds of the fight translate to him being able to do more damage on the feet? I just don't see Romanov's takedown defense holding up consistently enough for him to be able to take advantage of that over 3 rounds. And I think that he's shown enough of a ability to quit when things aren't really going his way, and he's not able to be the hammer as opposed to having to suffer as the nail. We've seen he's a really terrible nail, and Almeida is just not a guy that is going to allow himself to be a nail for long stretches of this fight. So I don't see Romanov's takedown defense holding up. I think Almeida's probably going to win by first round ground and pound knockout. A submission wouldn't necessarily surprise me. But it would be the first time Romanov's lost by submission in his MMA career. So I think that's worth pointing out if you're someone considering props. But give me Almeida by first round knockout. I do hope that enough money comes in on Romanov to keep him or Almeida in the minus 200 range, but we'll see what happens. The next fight is Kevin Holland and Michal Oleksiejczuk. Holland is on a 2-fight losing streak after dropping a split decision to Jack Della Maddalena at Noche UFC last year, followed by what was for many a very letdown performance at UFC 299 against Michael Venom Page. Michal Oleksiejczuk also last fought at UFC 299, in which he got kicked very early in the fight, did not react well to the damage from the strikes Pereira was throwing at him at all, and ended up getting choked out after conceding his back. So a club and sub, if you will, from Michel Pereira in a fight that I backed him as an underdog to win. I don't have much to say about this one. I think it's pretty interesting matchmaking, just kind of given where Holland is in his career and the inconsistent success that he had fighting at middleweight. It's interesting to see him go back up at this point. And it's an interesting opponent for Oleksiejczuk to have, given, I don't think this is a good matchup for him to have so soon after getting club and subbed, and given the lack of submission success he's had in his MMA career, and the fact that 4 of his 5 losses in the UFC have come by way of submission. 2 of which happened up at light heavyweight, and he lost last year to Caio Borralho in the second half of that fight by submission, just barely going over into the second half. And then obviously the most recent result being a club and sub at the hands of Michel Pereira. And this is, even going back to the Chidi and Jaquani fight, which was close to a pick'em, and a fight that I took Oleksiejczuk to win as the favorite in that one, he still kind of had to come back from Jaquani putting a lot of damage through kicks on him in that one. And at one point he did get hurt pretty bad, but was able to recover and battle back and end up making Jaquani kind of quit due to strikes of his own in that one, which was Fight Night Singapore in August of last year. I think the difference between, Jaquani and Holland at middleweight are 2 guys that profile very similarly from a physical perspective, and in terms of the strikes they offer. Holland obviously is just more willing to be forthright and let his hands go, but those are 2 guys that have not enjoyed a lot of success going the distance in their MMA careers. Holland even less so than Jaquani, but the key difference is that Holland has a much more sophisticated submission game available than what Jaquani had. And I think if Jaquani did have that, he would have had Oleksiejczuk in a much more compromising position after doing that damage to Oleksiejczuk than what ultimately transpired, and was one of the reasons Oleksiejczuk was able to come back. To that point, when Pereira was able to hurt Oleksiejczuk very early on in their own fight in his first appearance after that, he was able to take advantage with a submission and give Oleksiejczuk the 5th loss by submission of his MMA career. So I kind of see the same thing happening here. I have this fight graded very, very slimly in favor of Holland, but the line is too wide to where I would feel comfortable playing Holland based on the grade that I have. He was closer to, I think, minus like 250 earlier in the week, and he's now ballooned out to minus 300 at a couple of different books. But I recognize that Oleksiejczuk doesn't have as much of a chance to win is what my grade would indicate, because Kevin Holland's damage tolerance is just otherworldly. He might have the best chin in the entire UFC. Were it not for him breaking his hand on the kicks that Stephen Thompson was throwing at him, he wouldn't have a knockout loss on his record. And I mean, you're still even then looking at a situation where the only time that the guy's really been stopped due to damage is from a doctor's stoppage. So I don't trust Oleksiejczuk to be able to extend this fight to a decision or even hurt Holland enough to where he's able to get an outright decision win. What I think is much more likely is based on the hole in Oleksiejczuk's game that he showed and his early reaction to getting hurt, that if Holland starts fast and is able to hurt Oleksiejczuk early, that he's then able to turn that into snatching up a guillotine or an opportunistic takedown to where he's ultimately able to finish the fight on the feet, or not on the feet, on the ground, whether it's from grabbing his head on the feet and being able to take it down into something like a Darce choke, or probably not a guillotine, or he's just able to put Oleksiejczuk on the fence after getting hurt in a similar way to where Pereira was, and just kind of be more physical and use it to take his back and end up getting a rear naked choke. So I'm taking the under 1.5 here, because when I originally was grading this week, this was the only plus odds play that I had. And that I wanted to at least have one underdog play on this card. And thankfully the Kopylov Almeida line flipped to where I now have two. But I'm also taking this plus odds play, recognizing that I don't think that Oleksiejczuk has much finishing upside in this fight, given the damage tolerance that Kevin Holland has and the lack of a submission threat coming back from Oleksiejczuk. So I'm taking the under 1.5 here, but I'm doing it based on the pronounced confidence that I have that Holland is going to be able to hurt Oleksiejczuk early based on the recent results with Njokuani and Pereira, and that he's then able to turn that into a submission win, a club and sub. Holland's been real. People say don't bet Kevin Holland fights, and I, after taking him against Stephen Thompson and then seeing how he gave that fight away, I very much sympathize and understand that. I did end up taking Kevin Holland as a leg when he fought Chiesa at UFC 291. And even though I went to see him fight at UFC 287 and figured he was going to beat Ponzinibbio, and he did so in pretty pronounced fashion, I was still worried enough about him coming out the fight off of Thompson that I didn't end up playing him in that fight. Did play him as an underdog, I believe, against Jack Della Maddalena. Didn't work out. Venom Page was debuting, so I just stayed away from that one entirely. So I've mostly stayed away in a lot of these cases with many of these Kevin Holland fights. I also advocated for staying away when he fought Tim Means. I took the plus 1.5 when he fought Cowboy Oliveira and thought, based on the first round Cowboy Oliveira had, that play was looking good until, the first minute of the second round happened. But I do think that given where Holland kind of is in terms of having his back against the wall again, as he did going into the Ponzinibbio fight, that he's going to put forth his best effort to show out here and get himself back in the win column. Not just by, fighting safe on the feet against Oleksiejczuk, but really going aggressive in the first round and trying to get that club and sub. So give me Kevin Holland by first round submission. I don't think Oleksiejczuk is going to react well to a lot of the damaging strikes that Holland puts out. I think there's going to be a big speed disadvantage here. And I believe Oleksiejczuk is also giving up at least a bit of a reach advantage in this one. It's a 7-inch reach disadvantage for Oleksiejczuk here, and Holland's also got 3 inches of height. So that caused Oleksiejczuk some early turbulence against Njokuani in the same way that I think it's going to happen here. I just expect Holland to be able to more effectively capitalize on the damage that he does than Ninja Kwani was in that case. So Kevin Holland by first round sub. The co-main event at UFC 302 is Sean Strickland and Paulo Costa. Sean Strickland last fought at UFC 297, losing his middleweight title in a split decision to MMA Rax darling Dricus du Plessis. Paulo Costa last fought at UFC 298 against Robert Whittaker, losing a unanimous decision, but arguably looking more impressive in that fight than he did in a fight that he won against Luke Rockhold nearly about a year and a half prior. Strickland is someone that was formerly a betting nemesis of mine and has since become I've had very accurate reads on his last 4 fights. Before I started actually doing analysis, I thought he would lose to Uriah Hall and Jack Hermansson, and shortly after the Hermansson fight is when I actually started putting some analysis behind most of these picks, or all of these picks, rather. I picked him to beat Alex Pereira in what was one of my only missed picks at UFC 276. I picked him to beat Jared Cannonier in one of the most bizarre and difficult fights to score in UFC history in the last fight night of 2022, in which he lost a split decision to Jared Cannonier in a fight in which at least one judge scored at 49-46 and another scored at 49-46 the other way. Hedged on rounds when he fought Nasruddin Imavov at plus odds and successfully scored that correctly. Then took him as a favorite as a main parlay leg against Abus Magomedov in a fight where he dropped the first round, but Magomedov showed visible signs of running out of gas, and Strickland was able to just kind of totally turn on the burners in the second round and find a late knockout win. In a fight where people forget Strickland got poked pretty badly in the eye in the early parts of that round, in the early first round, to where people were wondering if that fight was going to end early or not. I was very nervous for that, compromising my big night I was going to have, and was grateful that Strickland was able to turn it around. The fight after that, I rather than play Adesanya at minus 500, I had that fight graded, I think, close to dead even, and decided to hedge on rounds at plus odds again, as I did when Strickland fought Nasruddin Imavov, and successfully got that fight correct as well. And then took Dricus du Plessis as the underdog against Strickland in Strickland's last appearance earlier this year, and in a fight that I thought du Plessis won, although it was very close. But that fight, again, kind of revealed just Strickland's tendency to rely a little bit too much on the jab. Costa is someone that I didn't get an accurate read on in the first of 2 fights that I put out grades for him over the last 2 years. I took the under when he fought Rockhold, and that didn't end up materializing. Then I took the over when he fought Whittaker, because I thought Whittaker would look to outpoint him as he has in so many of his other fights, and that's exactly what ended up happening. So inconsistent reads with Costa. It's funny, I remember when I started finally getting back into the sport during COVID, I think the first big pay-per-view that I tuned back into after, I think it might have actually been the first fight Volkanovski had with Holloway. The first or the second one, I can't remember in 2020 which it was, but I remember being, as a casual, very hyped for Adesanya versus Costa, just because it was a matchup of 2 undefeated fighters, and wishfully not really knowing that Costa hadn't really fought a great strength of schedule going into that. even though the Yoel Romero fight is remembered very, very graciously as a war. But I've always kind of enjoyed Costa just as a casual, even coming out of that fight. And obviously there was the whole controversy with the Vettori matchup and him losing that pretty handily in the fashion that he did, given the fuss that he made going into it. I think really tarnished his reputation, perhaps even worse than getting dominated by Izzy. And then we just haven't really seen much of him since, outside of the win from Rockhold. But he really is, in spite of the popularity the guy has, I don't know how many other fighters could lose 3 of their last 4 and see their star ascend the way that Costa has. It really is quite funny in many respects. But I don't think this is a good matchup for him at all. One thing that I think is very interesting is that Strickland has fought so many fighters in recent years that have had, if not an outright reach advantage over him, at least have kind of outmeasured him in reach, to where this is the first time since Strickland fought Jack Marshman back in October of 2020 that he has an outright significant reach advantage over one of his opponents. And I think that's very significant for a fighter that leans so heavily on his jab the way that Strickland does. Even though Costa is the far more accurate striker, these guys throw it they land at about the same volume. But as you saw was largely the key when Strickland fought Izzy, his defense is just so on point to where I think he's largely just going to frustrate Costa, especially given that this fight is going to be 5 rounds. I don't think this fight necessarily needs to be 5 rounds, but I don't see Costa having more success into this fight the later it goes. In fact, we saw when Costa fought Whitaker that the most success that he had was in the first round, when people presumably thought, because of the layoff that he had, that it wasn't, he wasn't going to be able to come out sharp, and he actually looked pretty good for that first round. I think, at least one of the judges to score it in his favor because of him nearly finishing the fight at the end of the first round before Whitaker kind of got saved at the bell, thanks to that spinning wheel kick that Costa landed. So I think that there's probably a world in which Strickland just kind of takes the first round off and then builds over the next 4. And I think that his far more considerable experience going the distance and competing in 5-round fights is probably what's going to serve him well here in regards to that. I don't see Costa mixing it up in a way where he makes it dangerous for Strickland or puts him on the ground. The submission upside for both of these guys is not very high. If one of them gets a knockout, you presumably think it's going to be Costa knocking out Strickland. But if that doesn't happen in the first 5 minutes, I think Strickland is just going to be able to measure him too accurately. And then once he's got his reads dialed in, he's not only going to be able to have more success with the jab, but just make himself totally unhittable. And Costa's just going to look really, really frustrated in boring fashion for 20 minutes. So I think, in addition to the 5-round experience, it's worth noting that Costa's only been to 4 decisions in his MMA career compared to 18 for Strickland. So 4.5 times more experience going the distance, more success in fights that go to decision than what Costa has seen. Again, he's lost his last 2 fights that have gone to decision, and he's lost 2 of the last 3 fights of his that have gone to decision. And the only time that he won in those cases was when he was fighting, Yoel Romero, I think, that was at least 39 at that point, so very, very far advanced in age. And then Rockhold, who again was, coming off something like a 3-4 year layoff and was, already something of an MMA dinosaur in his own right. So when he's actually had to fight legit contenders that are within the same realm of his ability and age range, it just hasn't gone well for him when he hasn't been able to get them out of there early. And the only guys that have been able to knock out Strickland were Zaleski dos Santos with, a wheel kick in the first round, similar to the one that Costa landed against Whitaker. But again, that was down a weight class for Strickland, now up at 185. You would think his chin is holding up presumably a little bit better now. And the only other guy that's knocked him out is Alex Pereira, who had, significant reach advantages over Strickland here that Costa's not going to be enjoying and is actually going to have to deal with his own reach disadvantage in his own right. So I don't see a lot of upside for Costa here. I think it's difficult to make a case for him as an underdog. And I'm honestly surprised the fight is lined as closed as it is, even though Strickland's already a 2-1 favorite. I think Strickland probably 49-46 is this. Wouldn't be surprising if he even 50-45s. Outside of him getting knocked out inside the first 10 minutes, this should be really light work for Strickland based on the amount of success he has had against opponents offering more threats to him on the feet than just, a one-punch nuke. He's done a good job. I mean, Adesanya, Magomedov, Imavov, Pereira, all of these guys have offered him more threats to deal with in terms of length than not only what Costa has had to deal with, but even Strickland just hasn't had a significant reach advantage to pair with his jab heavy approach since he fought Jack Marshman 4 years ago. I think that is so key to charting how this fight goes, that he's been able to have the run to success of winning a title with the style that he deploys, in spite of the fact that he hasn't been able to lean on reach. Now he finally gets to enjoy that again after accruing all this high-level fight experience. I just don't see this going well for Costa if he's not able to get an early finish. So give me Sean Strickland to win a dominant 5-round decision, and for Costa to look very frustrated and probably taunt Strickland and whatever throughout the fight, and for Sean to just not entertain any of that until it gets into maybe the final round and Costa hasn't really been put away, but it's evident he's been losing the whole fight, and Strickland knows he's going to win, and at that point he starts giving it back to him in kind of the same way that he was doing to Izzy at the end of their fight. And now we come to the main event. Islam Makhachev and Dustin Poirier. Makhachev is 25-1, has 2 straight wins over Alexandr Volkanovski, his only fights of 2023, the latter of which was a bit of a short notice replacement fight, given he was supposed to rematch with Charles Oliveira. Oliveira suffered a gruesome cut that unfortunately likely cost my dear DuBronx the last title shot of his MMA career in the UFC, especially in wake of the loss to Arman Sarukian. I figured Makhachev was just kind of going to play it safe, and he ended up taking Volkanovski's head off with a kick in the first round that set the stage for Volkanovski's damage tolerance not really being all the way back, and him losing his featherweight title to Ilia Topuria a handful of months later at UFC 298. So this will be Makhachev's first fight he's had a pretty good layoff, October of last year relative to June, especially compared to Dustin Poirier, who is coming off a massive win of his own over Benoit Saint Denis at UFC 299 in a fight that is more graciously remembered for Poirier than many of his fans would want to admit. Benoit Saint Denis did take the first round outright, and Poirier was jumping guillotine far more than he should have, even though he loves to kind of lean into that meme, as his fans of late, I think. Saint Denis made excuses about his cardio being compromised by staph infection, and, lean into that what you will, but it was an interesting result just because almost all of Poirier's knockouts prior to that fight have been more attrition-based than him knocking anybody out with one punch, much in the same way that I talked about with Randy Brown earlier. And so it was, I think, a statement to the power that people have liked to say that Poirier has had for a lot of his career that I haven't necessarily agreed with, just relative to some other harder hitters in the UFC. But you saw it finally on display against Benoit Saint Denis in what ended up being a comeback win for Poirier in a fight that I thought I had picked Saint Denis to win, and it felt good about after that first round, even though it was clear he was kind of starting to fade a bit, and I didn't feel great about that being a 5-round affair. But I do think that this line is completely ridiculous. Makhachev has ballooned out to a 700 favorite at most books. And while between Poirier being on the back end of his career, not necessarily having the most impressive overall performance against Saint Denis, and, kind of openly talking about how this could be it for him relative to retirement, which is not really a mindset that you want to have as a fighter going into a matchup with the pound-for-pound best MMA athlete in the world. There's still more here in terms of things to like for Poirier than I think he's perhaps getting credit for based on the line. I do think, for example, this is a guy that has more UFC finishes than Makhachev. Throws at nearly 2 times the volume, or lands rather at nearly 2 times the volume that Makhachev does, but obviously at the expense of being far more hittable and having suffered significantly more attrition than what Makhachev has had to deal with. But Poirier, he does have twice as much UFC experience as Makhachev does, and he does have a significantly shorter layoff than what Makhachev does. So you wonder if he's going to be able to enjoy a bit more success early in the fight than perhaps what Makhachev will as this fight, gets into the later stages. Or rather, as this fight exists in the first half and then, Makhachev is slowly able to build. But, I even though I wouldn't advocate the I wouldn't advocate playing Makhachev at the price that he's at, I still think that he's in a pretty good position here just based on Poirier's overconfidence in jumping guillotine in spite of the fact that he hasn't really ever landed one in the UFC. I believe most of his submissions are rear naked chokes, and he went a very long time without even winning a fight by submission. I believe over a decade, or about it was a month short of a decade. He won by submission against Jonathan Brookins in 2012, and then a month shy of a decade when he faced Michael Chandler, he then won by rear naked choke in the 3rd round of that fight. So I don't like that he's been, not only has he been too willing to jump guillotines as he showed against Saint Denis, but the read I had that made me feel good about Saint Denis beating Poirier was that Poirier in recent fights has been way, way too conciliatory of his back. especially when trying to return to his feet. And given Makhachev is inevitably going to put this fight on the ground, you just have to wonder what's going to happen when Makhachev is able to take his back and what he's going to be able to do with that. And I don't see Poirier hanging around for very long if that ends up being the case. You look at all the fights that Poirier has lost by finish, and the only one that has not fallen within the first 2.5 rounds of a fight is when he faced Korean Zombie in his first main event in 2012. And that ended up being a submission, but all the other losses by finish he's had since then, which is all but one of the losses he's had in the UFC, have been finishes that have arrived in the first half of a fight, or a 5-round fight. Even the fights where I don't believe he was lined to go 5 rounds, which might not have been many of them, actually. I don't think his first fight was his first. I can't tell if his first fight with Conor McGregor was a 5-round fight or not. I don't think it was, because it wasn't the main event of UFC 178. But his fight with Michael Johnson was the main event, and that ended in the first round. Obviously, when he fought Khabib, that was for the title. That was a 5-round fight. Ended in the first half. Granted, just shy of 2.5 minutes into the third round, but still in the first half. Lost in the first minute, or barely just over it, of the third round of his fight with Oliveira, in which he was too conciliatory of his back and had been far too conciliatory of his back in the round prior to that one, and Oliveira was able to quickly capitalize on that after returning to the corner. And then against Justin Gaethje, got knocked out by a head kick in the first minute of the second round of their fight. So there's a lot of attrition here for Poirier, which I think plays into why he's talked so openly about retiring. And even though, Makhachev had a bit of a rep as a boring fighter, I mean, 5 of his last 7 wins have arrived within the first 2.5 rounds of fights. And those are submissions over Drew Dober, Dan Hooker, a knockout of Bobby Green, who granted was a short notice opponent, the triangle choke on Charles Oliveira, and then when he got Volkanovski on a bit of short notice, he was able to knock him out with a head kick in the first round. So he's come into his own of a striker of late. And I don't think it's out of the question that he could end up knocking out Poirier. But obviously, the more direct path to victory here is Poirier jumps a guillotine, whether it's in the first or second round, probably earlier on, and he'll try that when they're both dry, as he tried about 3 times against Saint-Denis. He doesn't really have a lot of success getting back to the feet, and Makhachev is able to keep him on the ground. But even if he does manage to kind of scoot himself back to the fence, I just see him too easily giving up his back as he gets back to the fence, Makhachev dragging him down again, and then him hunting for the choke from there on in, and where he's able to, if not put the choke on him in the first round, does enough damage over at least the first 2 rounds where he's able to get an early third round finish in the same way that Khabib and Charles Oliveira were. So I think the better bet for this is under 2.5 rounds. And that also gives you the, if he does end up lucking into a guillotine or something, you figure that happens earlier in the fight when they're both dry. And, that minus 2.5 at least is still covers for, if you're thinking this fight is going to end by submission, that tends to happen much earlier in the fight when the fighters are not only drier, but also have more of their initial starting energy in place to execute a squeeze than for that happening later in the fight, even though that hasn't always been the case, such as when Poirier fought Chandler in what was a 3-round fight. I still think if Poirier has any path to winning, it's going to be some sort of chance freak flash finish in the early stages of the fight. And if Makhachev ends up winning, even though he's got, I think, a pretty clear path to winning by decision, he's been on enough of a roll here against a fighter that suffered the kind of attrition that Poirier has, that he just ends up having another statement win here. So I'm going to say Makhachev wins by second round submission. It won't surprise me if it happens earlier or later than that. I would be a little surprised if this does go the full 5 rounds. And obviously it would shock the world if Poirier finally gets rewarded for one of his haphazard guillotine attempts. But we'll see how it goes. That's going to do it for the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 302. Tragically, this is the last RAXPOD that I will be recording from my perch in Miami. So the esteemed view of which you've all been looking out on for the last year while I've been doing this prior to my on-camera appearance will be going away in short order. But I'll still be around to do these podcasts for the other pay-per-views going forward. Gonna be a good one in a handful of weeks after when we break down McGregor and Chandler, which is a fight that I've had my eye on for quite a while, given it was there was an article I produced for USA Today that was one of the last things that I did during my time doing content production for them. And that was over a year ago. So I've had my eye on that one for quite a bit of time. And it'll be interesting to see what other fights get put on that card in the interim, because right now there's only 2 prelim fights, and main card not looking the best. We'll see if they add another one to what's only a 5-fight pay-per-view. You would think they'd try to, especially given how expensive those McGregor tickets are, that they're going to try to jack up the price for that. But until then, thank you very much for tuning in. As I said at the top of the show, please like, share, and subscribe on Twitter and YouTube if you haven't already. And I will be back in a handful of weeks to break down the next pay-per-view for you. Thank you very much. Take care, folks.